In our study of the synthesis of yoga, we are in the chapter titled The Soul and Nature, and the backdrop to this discussion is Sri Aurobindo showing us the underlying unity and oneness of all reality, which must eventually be realized in the tiniest detail of every experience of life. And having placed that as the first foundation, he takes up step by step the various aspects of reality and brings them into alignment with that underlying unity to show how it is that same oneness which moves to differentiate itself as these very distinct and sometimes opposing facets of reality. Soul and nature are two such. When you distinguish one from the other, you see nothing in common, nothing that links. Anything that moves, anything that changes is nature. Anything that is unchanging, permanent, and perhaps essentially even timeless, free of all conditioning, is soul. How can these two ever meet? In their very definition, they are opposite to each other. In our subjective experience, we feel, we sense, we experience that we have a nature which is part of a larger nature, and that nature is as if pushing into us, trying to form us, determine even our thoughts, emotions, behavior patterns. And yet, subjectively we feel we are none of these things. We feel that we are free or should be capable of being free, and with that we feel a responsibility to assert that freedom. Not only that, we feel that we should be able to determine these patterns of nature and improve them, remove what is wrong, bring something which is better. And the sense of an individuality there, the sense of the soul, distinctly feels itself not nature. And so there is this collision of interests and objectives, and in spite of all the compulsive power that nature has on us, because it's the whole universe which is infinite versus I which is tiny and finite, in spite of that, not only I am able to be conscious, disengage myself to become reasonably free, but I am able to push back and even change my nature and my immediate surrounding nature, and eventually I hope to change all nature. These two, being fundamentally opposite to each other, how can they be really held in one underlying unified consciousness? Is that even possible? If it is so, we need to be able to recognize how from that oneness these two derive, and whether in that we can find the secret of their true relationship. In the discussion so far, Sri Aurobindo already showed us that this relationship of soul and nature exists on two very different levels. There is a lower relationship where nature seems to determine, control, and even is the source of our individuality and the sense of being a soul. But there is a higher relationship, not in the mind, which is formed by nature, not in the life energies or matter, which are also formed by nature, but in a spiritual state of consciousness, which is not formed by nature. And when our soul ascends to that state of a spiritual consciousness, I am spirit, at that point the relationship is reversed. Nature is found to be my power of expression. I am free, essentially lord of this whole play of energies. Between this lower relationship of being completely subject to nature and the higher relationship of being free and lord of nature, what's the transition? How can we ascend from this state to that? And Sri Aurobindo explains, with each step of the ascension of consciousness, our relationship with nature changes also, fundamentally. If you move up one step, you have a new relationship. Nature relates to you differently. Move up another step and you have a new relationship. Using the vocabulary of the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Aurobindo describes these as 6 stages or 6 relationships that we have. The Purusha is, says the Gita, that is, the soul is witness, upholder, source of sanction, knower, Lord, enjoyer. Prakriti, that is nature, is the executive power, and as an active power, she has an operation that corresponds to the attitude of Purusha. And this is what he is mapping now. In other words, as we will see, the Purusha status being 6-fold or in 6 degrees, at each of these degrees the Purusha can choose to relate to nature differently, and nature's activity then changes according to that relation. Now, why is this important? Because this is the means by which we as individuals, with what feels to be a very finite and limited power of consciousness, can actually ascend these stages and recast our relationship with nature at each step. First, recasting our relationship with our own nature. That means our own thoughts, our own emotions, even our physical instincts, and the relationship of I being bound to my instincts, bound to my emotional reactions, bound to my habits of thought, can shift now to a status through these 6 steps until I can say, I decide how my mind thinks. I choose the play of my emotions. I reprogram my body and its instincts to be what I will freely. This is the kind of freedom that we wish to experience. The problem in this whole discussion is the moment I begin to choose my thoughts, I shape my thoughts, I think differently. What happens? I get sucked into the thought process itself. I get sucked into the emotions which I am now trying to change. I become identified with the body in which I am trying to modify my instincts and reactions. I have lost my position of soul, who is free. I become engaged, and the moment I am engaged and struggling with my thought and emotions, they bind me. You've ever tried to do that when you have a sticky thought or a sticky emotion that bothers you, especially if it catches you in the middle of the night? You wake up with something that's bothering you, and the more you grapple with it, the more it pulls you into it, and there is no way out. Perhaps the only way was not to mess around with it and step away from it and walk away. Then perhaps you will be reasonably free and it will go on doing exactly what it wants. But you can never master it by getting into it. And so the key Sri Aurobindo shows us is through this 6-fold ascension, the soul remains soul. It never enters nature. But by changing its relationship with nature, nature changes also to reflect its new relationship. Until at its height, the soul takes on the poise of lordship and freedom and enjoyer, when nature flows to now fulfill the soul's choice or will freely, while the soul still remains free, not embedded, not entering it to struggle with it. Simply by changing the relationship of how it perceives nature, it shifts the very response of nature. And so this text is extremely valuable. It shows us the key to our practical freedom in poise of consciousness. And the process itself may take time, but it can be partially accomplished, at least in certain parts of our consciousness. And once that is done, the next step still remains: who then is controlling nature? Who then always was controlling nature? Even though I shift my status and acquire the poise of a degree of freedom, and nature now begins to reflect my choice, what is nature formed out of? And this will involve a widening of your consciousness to recognize the larger reality of which your own consciousness is a part. And so we will explore this whole portion today. So far in our study, we looked at the first three statuses of soul, which he describes as witness, upholder, and source of sanction. At first, we make a conscious effort to disengage from this identification where we feel ourselves a victim of nature. We make an effort to step back and not become this emotion or thought which seems to possess us. And you go through a triple stage of separation. First, a kind of a strong tamasic renunciation. I don't care, I don't want to participate, I just want to be free. And then a more rajasic form, maybe a disgust and aversion for this whole condition of nature's working, or a higher sattvic, luminous intelligence, which simply recognizes that that's how nature is, and I choose to be aloof and rest in my separation. And perhaps it could also have a kind of an impersonal delight. That's an interesting show, that's an interesting drama of life. Well, that's how life is. Meanwhile, I'm quite free, happy, being myself. Nothing that I can do about what's happening. But from this poise of pure witness, there is the next position of the upholder. And the soul actually can choose to reject the fact that it's upholding. It can pretend to be not upholding, refusing the function of upholder or sustainer. But the reality is that the moment you cease to interest yourself in what's happening, well, what's happening begins to fade out. Fade out to your own consciousness, but literally within you, in your own thoughts and emotions, if you are not vigilantly observing what's happening, or in a very detached way enjoying, it loses force. And it tends to subside. Something does change. And you realize that your interest, even in remaining aloof, keeps it going. You realize that somewhere as a backdrop you are supporting it. When we take a few examples, if a child comes and playfully splatters paint on my face or on my clothes, I can say, well, he's playing, doesn't bother me. But unless I am present, the paint doesn't have a surface to stick to. It is held by the very fact that I am present. And if I were to remove myself entirely, the paint and the clothes would just collapse. They do not have any support which keeps them going. And so this second poise can be a refusal by the soul. It can refuse to recognize that it sustains or upholds, and so say, I am just a witness. But once it begins to accept, it can take a more tamasic position, saying, well, I do uphold. The fact is that my energy or my support is what allows this energy to flow. Because my energy is there, these things happen. If I become unconscious, then all the thoughts stop, all the emotions shut down. When I become conscious, all the thoughts activate, all the emotions start playing. So the fact that I'm aware does give energy to it, but I don't really do anything. Who is doing it? That is something outside me. And Sri Aurobindo throws in 3 words: God, or force, or Maya. Now he brings in these 3 terms because there are various philosophical positions arising, of course, from some experience which justify these different ways of looking at it. But later he will show you what these terms resolve themselves into when you actually attain to the full status of the enjoyer who is also Lord. You will find these three terms become something profound, which are your own higher power, so to say. But for the moment, I am this little person, and while my thoughts move on, well, who made it happen that way? Well, God formed it this way. And you have the perspective even existing today in modern science. They don't use the word God, but they will say, it's like in the Big Bang, a great force was released and it's moving, it's doing it. We don't know from where it came. Religion said it was God who wound up the universe and set it in motion, and then he watches and judges you. But science only picked up that same idea, removed God, you still have the wound up energy of the Big Bang which is keeping it going. So there is something, God, or force, we don't know from where it came, but the force is going on. And interesting, in physics, they will just say there is a continuous entropy. What does that mean? Disorder. What does that mean? Somewhere there was a greater order which is now collapsing into disorder, and the act of collapsing into disorder is the energy which drives everything, is the clockwork spring that motivates everything. But what does it really mean? Where was this origin of the order? Why is it going to disorder? What force pushes it to disorder? In so formulating the question, the solution, all that physics has done is pushed away the source of the force one step above, and says now it's no more in my domain. That's for the metaphysicians or the religious or philosophical people to sort out. As far as physics is concerned, it's just energy moving into greater entropy. And it's a very convenient way of avoiding the question, but the fact is there is a force driving everything. Or Maya. Because in fact we realize the way the force works is through some extraordinarily skillful intelligence, extraordinary power of formation which follows this intelligence. So when you see how the beautiful leaf emerges out of the stem, or how the plant emerges from the seed, the way the plant negotiates the challenges of the soil. If the sprouting seed encounters a rock, well, the seed moves around the rock and bypasses it. What in it had that extraordinary intelligence? Or if you see on a more macroscopic scale in your life, you find a problem has come your way and you tried to avoid it, and the problem moved like a chess player to block you again in your avoidance, saying, no, you have to face me. So on various levels we see some kind of an extraordinary intelligence and a power to execute the intelligence working behind the scenes, a cunning, skillful, and that is the aspect of Maya. So in the poise of the pure witness, who was holding up the game? Oh, it was God or force or Maya. But now when the soul shifts its poise and says, well, I recognize that I am the one who's upholding it, then who is it that is driving the game? Who is it that sanctions that the game takes this direction on that? Not me. I just happen to be the one who's providing the support. That is still God or some force or Maya. You see, successively as the position changes, we discover there is something else doing something else behind the scenes, and you shift your position now to include more of its responsibility into your sphere. So first you were only witness, not upholding. Now you shift and realize, yes, you are upholding. And now who is sanctioning? Who allows the game to go this way or that way? Who allows the problem to emerge or the problem to suddenly vanish? Oh, that must be the other fellow, God or force or Maya. Now all three we will find resolving themselves into something extraordinary as we complete this passage. We then come to the third stage. The attitude of upholder having been taken, you realize that in upholding, you can uphold this way or remove your upholding poise. In this matter I choose to uphold, in another matter I choose not to uphold. And seamlessly you've moved to the position of the sanctioner. The beauty with which Sri Aurobindo articulates these transitions shows you that in fact there is no difference. The position of witness purely already contained within it the upholder choosing to be passive. And the position of upholder contained within it the power of the sanction giver choosing to not give sanction. You see, it's implied, the next step is implied, if only we became conscious. Now let's see how these three steps correspond to our own relationship, let's say, with our thoughts or emotions. As a witness, I say, you know what? If you're going to work with me, keep in mind, I tend to get moody sometimes, especially when I eat certain kinds of food, or if the weather is not all right, and I'll get angry if you don't do things right, or if you're late. And that's just my nature. You know, I'm born Aries or Scorpio or whatever it is you're blaming your tendency to be. I can't help it. That's how it is. Better put up with it. So I have set up a relationship where nature is doing everything and everything else, my consciousness is only, that's how it is. I don't care. Witness to some degree. I then shift one step to recognize, you know, when I get angry, I get angry. I am the one who accepts that this tantrum of anger continues, and I can choose now at least to withhold it a little bit. I realize I just got upset with a little child, and the moment that realization comes, instantly I dim the anger. The upholding support of the anger now reduces, and the anger with it softens. And having had this happen many times, I may say, why don't I do that with others whom I care for? And I begin to exercise that power of sanction. In this way, very slowly, in the journey of life, we begin to take responsibility and recognize that in fact we can choose, though slightly. And over a very long period of time, we do improve a little bit in our character. Or we may take a more rapid position of change and say, well, I don't like this person. Often it happens as a result of a crisis where you're forced to face something. I don't like this person, I need to change this habit. And then you put up a Herculean effort to force, to will down, to change the pattern of emotions or thoughts. Again, the relationship there is an utilization of the sanction-giving position. I withhold, whenever the anger tends to rise, I withhold my participation or the energy given into it. Or I cultivate the opposite. I give sanction, I give more push to positive emotions of happiness, of compassion, of understanding. I make effort to drive my thoughts in the direction of trying to see from others' viewpoint. And this is the basic mechanism by which we learn to control our thoughts, emotions, or even our instincts. We could take it a little further, especially with the physical instincts. When you say, I don't like this food. Why don't you like it? Well, that's how I am. Oh, in childhood there was an event where when I ate it, I had a strong reaction. And then you can say to yourself, but do I need to? Can I not change that? And you begin to assert on the body the same pattern of sanction, positive or withdrawal, negative sanction, to modify the behavior until I can cultivate the taste for this particular food which I used to hate. Or otherwise, I like something so much but it's having a negative effect, I teach myself to dislike it, or at least to become neutral to the liking. Up to this point, in these three steps, we have a very clear sense of what's possible, but it's a slow and difficult process. The next three are what lead us to a more profound insight, but also a greater power of transmutation of the relationship. So here Sri Aurobindo says, if it habitually selects and rejects in what is offered to it, it determines. So the question is only of making more frequent habit. The relatively passive has become an entirely active sanction and is on the way to be an active control. And we have to consciously put ourselves all the way to this stage. Everything that happens within our life, we have to now learn to apply to some degree an active sanction, positively or negatively, to steer the patterns of nature, at least in the part that's directly within our control, and the immediate space around us, which we are responsible for. You see, in this we can take the analogy of a person who's responsible for a space, let's say the principal of a school. He's not directly involving himself with what happens in the classrooms. So he could just say, look, I'm sitting here, it's the teachers who are teaching, and if a parent comes to complain, you say, talk to the teachers, I'm not involved there. And he disavows his responsibility. And yet, when there is the school function, the entire school function is waiting for him to step in and take his chair before they will start. Principal is late, we wait. Why? Because in fact the whole machinery running around him is dependent on his presence and only operates when he is present. If the king is not sitting on the throne, the ministers can sit and take any decisions, sign any papers, it will have no authority. But when the king sits on the throne, he can say, you know what, I'm just sitting here daydreaming. They're the ones deciding, blame them. I didn't do it, they signed the papers. But if he was not sitting, those signed papers would have no authority. But at the third stage, the king frowns. And people see his frown and they say, wait, let's not sign so quickly. And they begin to review. The principal, watching the show, says to the teachers, I'm not happy with this. And immediately it starts a reaction. He doesn't say what you should do. But the teachers now begin to anticipate what is it that will make him happy. What is the king thinking about? Why is he frowning? What can we do to improve? And so the machinery moves, it determines what it wants to do. You didn't tell it, do it this way. But just your shift of attitude created the ripple and the change of relationship of nature with you. So what we are describing so far not only applies to your immediate substance of mind, emotions and body, but also the immediate environment where your consciousness has some degree of responsibility. This position of active control and even of possessor and director of the knowledge and the will. This it becomes when the soul accepts its complete function as the knower, Lord and enjoyer of nature. So this is going to be the next three steps. Knower, Lord and enjoyer. Now we had seen this text already last time, so I'm going to only summarize, but it's important to review it now from the big picture, because then we will see what the culmination of this whole sequence leads to. As the knower, the soul possesses the knowledge of the force that acts and determines. It sees the values of being which are realizing themselves in cosmos. It is in the secret of fate. And we saw how profound this line is last time. When I am conscious, when I know that this is not good, the fact that anger is not something which is good, it's not helping the circumstances, it's not me, it's not my value. The moment I become conscious of my value and recognize this is not my value, just that awareness that I am a being of joy and love and compassion and not of hatred and anger and misunderstanding. Just becoming conscious in this triggers the change process in nature. Nature now begins to orient itself towards this. There is an exercise that the mother recommends for reprogramming your nature. It is extremely powerful. It is based on this principle. Extremely powerful, and you can actually reprogram thought patterns, emotion patterns, even instinctive reactions very rapidly. And the method she gives is, at the end of the day, before you go to sleep, and this is very important, it should be before you go to sleep, you review the whole day. Observe the patterns of thoughts, emotions, reactions, conversations, your feelings, which you may never have expressed but were felt. Observe, but very impersonally. And this is important. You have to first disengage. The position of witness is necessary for the whole chain to begin. As long as you're engaged in nature, you cannot change it. So first poise of witness, observe in a very detached way all that has happened as if somebody else's life. And from that very detached, unaffected, undisturbed poise, you notice, I got angry there. Observe the chain which led to the anger. Become conscious. Bring it into your knowledge. And then in that very act of doing, you have brought it into the open. It's no more a subconscious chain of cause and effect. It comes into your conscious awareness. And now you put a choice. I don't want this. Ideally, you put the positive choice also. Not this, but what? Because if you just try to remove, you leave a vacuum. And in a vacuum, what is easiest to pop up will tend to pop up. So I choose not this, but next time when somebody insults me, I will say, thank you. Or I will say, same to you, and give a smile. So I assert a positive turn of that response, disavow the negative tendency. In what? In my awareness. She uses the phrase, put a will. In putting a will, you are putting a will, but you are not getting into the nature process itself. The will is what gets into the nature process. After that, your mind turns away, moves to the next and the next. And completing everything, we may consciously offer it to the divine, place it under influence of a higher power, and go to sleep without the burden of it. Now, the going to sleep immediately after has this effect that whatever intentions you have released into nature are now beginning to sink deep, and they enter your subconscious and work within and shape from inside. The result will be within a few days, as the habitual reaction of anger begins to rise, before you're about to say those words of abuse, you remember, you become conscious, and you stop. There is an exercise of will which had been infused into nature, which is now popping up in the nature process. If at that moment you are still in the poise of witness, you will see the anger rising, and then you will see in nature something pausing. Or from your poise of conscious witness, you'll see the anger rising, and you'll say, this is what I didn't want. And immediately the anger will diffuse, soften, or stop. There'll still be difficulty on the surface in nature, but that programmed suggestion will now pop up. You will control, you will smile, you will say thank you, and walk away. You as witness, observer, no more detached witness, but now active sanctioner, have exercised not only earlier the will before going to sleep at night, but now this choice. Now, assuming you don't have this conscious when the anger is rising, you'll still have the same result, because from that poise of witness that you held for the 10 minutes before sleeping, you infused something which continues to act in the day when you are not witness, you are fully engaged, you are involved in your nature habit. At the end of the day, again, you will step back from the poise of witness, infuse this, the active giver of sanctions, but from a poise of knowledge. And the knowledge infused, the intention put in the will works. And although during the day you are involved, it changes. Of course, if you're also practicing development of the poise of equality in life or the witness position in life, you will have at the moment of the rising anger the ability to intervene and the effort, the will put before also working from both directions. Now you see in this method extraordinary power. You can reprogram anything, including physical habits. There are people who complain, every time I eat such and such a food, I fall sick. Why? I don't know, that's how my stomach is. That's my nature, that's my heredity, my astrological chart, whatever you wish to blame. But it's still a habit unknown. Go through this process. Become conscious in that poise of witness of what is shifting as the stomach starts feeling queasy. You will notice very likely even in the act of taking the food to your mouth, your stomach has started feeling queasy from past habit of association. And at that point, you can not only work on this at night before going to sleep for the subconscious effect, but right now at this point when I am taking it, I can put a will on my stomach. No queasiness, withhold this. And the imprint is holding in check a tendency. And I might start with a tiny bit of the food. And so I'm convinced, and my stomach can be convinced, it's small enough that I won't fall sick. And I do this a few times. And then a little more, and a little more, and a little more, until one day I say, I can eat it fully, all queasiness, all reactions gone. This is in fact the method used in developing, in freeing yourself from many kinds of allergies. You take tiny bits of the thing which causes allergy and habituate the body to it at a level which is tiny. But here you're using the same willpower indirectly. Somebody else is asserting the will. If it's a child who has this allergy, the parent says, all right, now we're going to take a tiny bit of this. And giving it in the food, the parent's will is working. Somebody's will has to be there. Somewhere there has to be the witness which exercises the choice from its position of sanctioner, who has now also knowledge. So the first step of this is knower. You have to know, and from the poise of knowledge you shift your relationship. And how is that happening? The phrase he uses here is, as the knower, the soul possesses the knowledge of the force that acts and determines. It sees the value of being, the values of being which are realizing themselves in cosmos. And it is on a large scale in cosmos, it is in the secret of fate. But when it's just in your body or in your mind, the values of being. I am calm, I am strong, I am healthy, I am immune to this food. That's the value of your being in consciousness and in knowledge, and nature follows as a result. Maybe bit by bit, maybe in small steps, but inevitably. The reverse also is true. If you start with the negative idea, I am so weak, my genetics is so bad, I've inherited a sensitive and weak body, my parents used to have this problem, so I can't help it. I will have diabetes because they had it. And in the very act of that acceptance and the dwelling on it, you are sanctioning, and if done consciously, you are giving it the full force of your knowledge and the values of being. The value of my consciousness, the state of my consciousness is my fragility and impotence to this tendency. And it's a choice that was made by the value of the being put forward. And if I shift the value of my being, that also will shift. All this while, remember, you never got into nature in a struggle and a battle. You only shifted your relationship with nature, and the ripple effect followed. Now this applies even in a broader scale in our life. When you look at tendencies or patterns of events around you, I find that whenever I ask for help from people, they tend to refuse. Or I find that people turn away from me, I don't have too many friends, I'm not a likable person. You may have that idea. But why? Because the value of my being was, I'm not likable. I don't like people. And if I don't like people, it's the value of not liking, and I'm automatically creating a field that ripples out to create that result. And if I shift my value of being, I love people, I am the most likable, it will begin to ripple out. I remember this experience I had. My mother sits in the office in the ashram where we also sell some books. And sometimes she asked me to sit, and I never liked that because I always felt overwhelmed by the too many people, and it was always too much. And so I would sit there and hope somewhere inside me, I hope nobody really comes. Not formulated as a thought, but just so that I don't get this overwhelming energy pushback. And the result was, whenever I sat, well, there was nothing happening. And one day I realized this is what was the cause of it. I said, no, I should change this, or I should be able to change. And so that day I sat and I said, I embrace everyone that comes. It was hard. There was a reaction in the emotions. Oh. And the result was, rush of people came and my numbers went up. It was still not a very comfortable experience to have that overwhelming thing. If I had worked on it a little more, perhaps even that would have been changed. But it was just as simple as a shift of state of consciousness. The values I hold as me, as awareness, in knowledge, has this ripple effect. So it sees the value of being which are realizing themselves in cosmos. By who? That working, God, fate, of God, force or Maya. But it's realizing these values of being. It is in the secret of fate. If you take this poise now all the way to the true poise of consciousness, not just I who am conscious here, but the true soul or self that is behind supporting this, what it chose, what it held as its value of being is the inevitable unfoldment in nature, in space and time. Fate. What is fate? Something which seems somehow determined, and whatever you may try to do is going to happen. Who determined it? This. How did it determine it? It didn't say, I will push here, I will push there. It didn't get into the details. It held this poise of consciousness, this state of being, in awareness, in knowledge, and the rest ripples out inevitably. You put a magnet behind a surface. The magnet is just sitting, it's not doing anything, it doesn't even care what's behind your surface of paper. And you sprinkle their iron filings, you bring objects nearby, they will all change in pattern, automatically align around the magnetic field. Did the magnet even bother with where is that filing, how to push it, what is the intelligence? Nothing. It just remained, those things happened. And that's the way fate unfolds. And the beauty of fate, therefore, is you can try to avoid it, but the means that you throw to avoid are precisely the means which eventually become the cause of the outcome. Very interesting. That's when we say fate or some necessity or some God power, but we don't see what is behind is this free choice of the self. What the self sees itself to be, knows itself to be, unfolds inevitably in the movement of nature as the fate, inevitable in space and time. So it, from this poise now, from knowledge, it is in the secret of fate. It's not yet master of fate, but in the knowledge it has the secret of fate. But from knowledge will be, remember, Lord and enjoyer. That's when the mastery will come. But the force is itself determined by the knowledge, which is its origin and the source and the standardizer of its valuations and effectuations of values. We saw this last time, but the very fact that you have the knowledge It is the originator of the force. We have seen the earlier examples. It leads to that. But he has used two phrases. Standardizer of its valuations. What the values are, become the norm, become the standards. And it is the effectuation also, the source of effectuation of the values, makes them, compels them to take effect. Therefore, in proportion as the soul becomes again the knower, it becomes also the controller of the actions. The more you are conscious of the values and the working of the force, the more you are controlling. But again, without getting into nature. Suggestion. He throws in the word once again as the soul becomes. Therefore, in proportion as the soul becomes again the knower. Why again? When was it the knower? Oh, it was long, long, long ago, before it entered into this movement of experience. It was always the knower in its origin. And then it entered into this experience of the individual focus and experience of life, and somewhere along the way lost that knowledge, lost the poise of knower and the poise of Lord and enjoyer, which was present in its origin. So in the sequence of events, in the cosmic manifestation, there is the soul looking at the whole possibilities and releases from it the power to fulfill those possibilities, and it says, I want to enjoy it from inside the game, and it puts forward a part of itself into the game. And at that point in the entry into the game, it loses the poise of lordship and knower, and becomes now as if a tool and puppet of nature. She is nourishing me, she is making me. I am born with my body, and when my body dies, I will cease to exist. Or so it feels. And so you have lost the true knowledge, increasingly as you recover it. Therefore, in proportion as the soul becomes again the knower, it becomes also the controller of the actions of nature. Nor can it do this without becoming the active enjoyer, bhokta. Now, if you become the knower, and with knowledge comes the controller of action position, you are increasingly acquiring lordship. You are not yet Lord, because it's still a limited capacity that you have as an individual. You're increasingly coming into control of the actions. What is it within you that's choosing this or that? What is it within you that's exercising this control or this direction? Something in you enjoys. This is more interesting. That is less interesting. And so more of this, less of that. And the enjoyer is there inherent in this position. So in the chain you will see, Sri Aurobindo shows you how each of the successive positions was inherent in the very first step. If you have first the position of witness, well, obviously you are upholder. If you are upholder, obviously you are sanction giver. If you are sanction giver, obviously you have the knowledge of the sanction that you are giving. And if you have the knowledge of the sanction giving and the force that's playing out, then you have now the control. And if you have the control, then you are enjoying, which is why you are exercising the control. You are also enjoyer. In the pure position of the witness, all of these layers had collapsed to become unexercised, but they were present. And successively, these layers can come forward and take their place. And with each of these coming into place, you grow in knowledge, grow in the control, power, and the joy, the enjoyment. If you can once stabilize yourself perfectly, or as close to perfectly as possible, in the witness position, the rest of the chain is inevitable. And you see why it's so important to develop that part of the consciousness that can step back from the tendencies of your nature. From there, all the rest becomes possible. But is already there, present within. You don't have to develop a new capacity. You only to draw out what is already inherent. In steps, in stages. And so with the knower, increasingly the action of the force is in your control. You have grown to become controller. And you are now active enjoyer. The Sanskrit word bhokta from the Bhagavad Gita. What kind of enjoyment is it? Recall last time we discussed how each of these 6 stages can be experienced on all levels. But they become more perfect as the levels rise. So you can even be enjoying things at a lower level. I am partially witness, partially able to disengage. And even in that partial disengage, I have some control and I am enjoying. But I am still a product of nature. I am largely embedded in nature with some partial enjoyment. So there is enjoyment at this level. And then as I grow into increasing freedom in a higher grade of consciousness where the freedom is effortless, and from there the control grows, enjoyment grows, the grade of enjoyment is completely different. What's the difference between this and that? And this is what he gives you now. The text he gives is extremely profound, extremely suggestive, and we'll try to explore some of the implications. In the lower being, the enjoyment is of a twofold kind, positive and negative, which in the electricity of sensation translates itself into joy and suffering. But in the higher, it is an actively equal enjoyment of the divine delight in self-manifestation. If we just take this one sentence with these 2 parts and go into the details of it, you will find extraordinary implications, many important ideas which are implied behind this. So first, in the lower being, the enjoyment is of a twofold kind, but in the higher being, it is not twofold, it is single, equal. Why is it twofold here? In the lower being, the consciousness is divided, and therefore any experience gets fragmented, even in its perception, even in the experience itself. Whereas in the higher being, which is in the consciousness of the spirit, there is only spirit. There is no divided consciousness. Spirit is always one, indivisible, complete. And so there the experience is also delight of what? Its own manifestation. Because there is nothing else. But in here in the lower being, because there is I and there is the not I and the bulk of it is not I, there is always the fragmentation. So enjoyment is fragmented into 2 kinds, positive and negative. Which in the electricity of sensation translates itself into joy and suffering. So now there are 2 different things. There is the enjoyment itself, which is positive and negative, and then in the sensation and the electricity that flows in the sensation, it takes this form of joy and suffering. But at its essential level, it has nothing to do with joy or suffering. It is still enjoyment that is positive or negative. And so let's see how that works. You have, let's say, something which happens to you which would make you happy, and you say, oh, this is so good, I am so happy. It's positive enjoyment. And something happens now which causes you distress, and you are now upset or you are depressed. What do? I am so unhappy. I am so depressed. I am so. And where does this go? I call up everybody. I meet people. I say, you know how unhappy I am. You know how depressed I feel. And someone says, snap out of it. Things will change. You don't understand. I am so miserable. And you see what's happening somewhere inside. You're affirming a kind of an enjoyment and wallowing in that distress, but it's a negative enjoyment. Well, it's still enjoyment. The energy you're putting into this wallowing in the experience is exactly the same as in the positive experience. You are enjoying, but positively or negatively. Now at this stage, you recognize from the experience of the way you enjoy it is exactly the same. But when that positive or negative experience enters the electricity of your nerves, then you say, this is joyous and this is suffering. When are you suffering? When you translate it into terms of the electricity of the nervous system, evoking in your emotions or mind something. But the way the soul meets it, without this electricity of the nerves, is just a positive kind and a negative kind. And you have to dwell upon this. It's something extremely profound. If you begin to introspect, you will discover it's actually a choice that you can make. Whether you accept an event with a positive enjoyment or with a negative enjoyment. The same positive thing that somebody will see as positive, you can choose to enjoy it negatively. Oh, I'm so happy I won the lottery of 100 rupees. And the other fellow says, what? A lottery of 100 rupees? What a waste of time. I've been wasting so many hours buying all these tickets. What's the difference? So there's this classic example of someone looks at the glass and says, it is half full. I can drink water. And someone says, oh, it's half full. Something is missing in it. How you look is just that shift of the choice made. But the person who is miserable because it's half full is enjoying that condition of feeling miserable, or the experience which is behind it, which once it enters the nerves, takes on this character in the electricity of a joy or suffering. But if you step back from the joy, suffering to the deeper poise, you can shift it there and actually choose to translate any situation into joy, if you so decide. And if you don't so decide, then you chose to not so decide, and you chose to accept it as a suffering. Once you realize the implication of this, once you face the implication of this, you realize that you are responsible when you are suffering. It's not nice to accept this because it suddenly puts the entire burden of responsibility on you. But if you can face it, you come to the conclusion, I have no reason to ever be unhappy or suffer. At least to the extent that I can become conscious. To the extent I am not conscious, well, it's machinery in my body. You stick a needle, it causes pain. But in the part where I am conscious in my thoughts and emotions, I can choose to not be unhappy about the pain. I say, oh, okay, it hurts, but here I have a choice. Problems come in my life and I can say, okay, so now something wants me to grow up. What's the message? What do I need to do now? And that's the choice you make. I've mentioned before the example of somebody in the ashram. He's the head of our laboratory, now almost 90 years old. And he shared his experience with me. He said at the age of 21, one day he just woke up, one morning. He just wakes up and realizes, I can choose to be happy. Happiness is my birthright. Nothing can take away from me this choice. And he said, I decided never again in life to be ever unhappy. I'll always be happy. A choice he made. And that's it. Poof, it was done. And he says, never in his life, whatever may have happened, he never lost his poise of being happy. And it is as easy as this. The recognition and the choice made. And that's it. And so when we come to this, from knower to controller preparing for Lordship, and comes the enjoyer. You realize you can actually choose to be enjoying, and the choice of a positive enjoyment rather than a negative enjoyment. But the fact is, as long as you're in this divided grades of experience, in the divided mind, divided life energy, divided matter, there will always be this twofold kind of enjoyment, positive and negative, which in the electricity of sensation translates itself into joy and suffering. So having got into you in the electricity of sensation with this duality, you can still make a choice of which side of the duality you choose to be. But the experience here, the knowledge here is very profound. There is a choice made on a deeper level, and then there's its translation into the electricity of the nerves. If you removed the electricity of the nerves, what would the consciousness be like? How would you relate to it? And why is it in the electricity of nerves does it translate into this duality? And there's a deep suggestion here. I don't want to go too much into it, but he uses the word electricity. He could have just said in the sensations of the nerves. And he's saying this because this is the reality happening. The electricity itself is a physical translation of life energy, and the principle of delight, ananda, working in the material domain. And that's why joy or delight in physical body or in emotions always has an electric character. But the pure ananda will always have this equal enjoyment of the divine delight in the fragmented consciousness of matter and emotions, or to that extent mind, because electricity operates on all three levels. In the fragmented consciousness, this takes on this duality in electricity. So just as there is a physical electricity in the physical nerves, there is an emotional electricity in the emotional consciousness and a mental grade of electricity in the mental consciousness. That experience we would have all had at some point when in certain states you have a bright illumination of or inspiration or insight, and like a flash, like a light, but with it comes a feeling of an electric current in the mind. And it is to this he is referring, because the origin of that electric character is up there in the principle of the bliss translating on all these levels into the physical body and nerves, into matter. And so physical electricity that you measure in your science lab or in the electronics of the devices which you hold has this dual character of negative and positive because of this, because it is in matter in a divided consciousness. But now I'll just touch upon this briefly a little more. In the physics of it though, in the mathematics of the electric current, we have a problem. We do not know whether electricity is electrons flowing this way or the negation, a lack of electrons flowing the other way. You see, when an electron is missing in the atom, we call it a hole. So when an electron jumps from this atom to the next, it leaves a hole. And then another electron takes its place, leaving behind a hole. So when electrons go forward this way, the holes are jumping backward this way. Right? So this is your one flow of electricity, and this is the other flow of electricity. Now when you actually look at an electronic circuit, is it electrons flowing this way or holes flowing that way? And it's been a problem for physicists for a very long time, going back 150 years. And the mathematical explanation for this, the conclusion was, they are equivalent concepts. To say that electrons flow this way is equal to saying holes flow that way, or that both flow that way. Electron flows, hole flows, both flowing across is equal mathematically to just electrons flowing or just holes flowing. Meaning, and at a very physical level, there is only one underlying truth, represented in two ways of looking at it. There is a flow of delight or sensation or experience in a fragmented consciousness in which you can see it therefore as positive or negative, that it's one thing which cannot be divided in its essence. Pure physics. You see, the truth of what we discovered psychologically and the electricity aspect of that truth all the way down to the physical plane. And if you can hold this, it's such a beautiful idea. It's such a beautiful vision of the truth of this, the nature of experience, of delight, or its apparent division into joy and suffering, all the way down to matter. And so that's why I said this phrase is extremely profound in what it carries. Reading it casually, we would just say, oh, it's a poetic description, he's describing electric movement. No, there's much more to it. So this is the reality at a lower level. There is still the underlying truth of one indivisible experience which now gets split in appearance. And the soul experience it positively or negatively. But as we rise up in consciousness, and as we enter the higher status increasingly, where the division becomes less and less prominent, and when we are finally in the oneness of spirit, in the higher, it is an actively equal enjoyment. Everything that comes, all experiences, is equally received with equal joy and with equal active enjoyment. It's not like I enjoy this more, I enjoy this less, or to this I am not so active, to that I am more active. Equally active to all things. Oh, wow, wow. Now, again, to take an example here in the physical experience of matter in our body, and this is an example Sri Aurobindo gives in The Life Divine. He says, if you observe the nature of pleasure and pain, which is the positive and negative side in the sensation, what distinguishes one from the other? If you gently caress the skin, that feels nice, it's pleasurable. Now the person starts pressing a little more, increase the pressure, or just continue long enough, eventually, okay, now that's getting irritating. Now it's getting painful, enough, why don't you stop it? The transition from pleasure to something relatively neutral to something which is now painful is a continuous scale. What determines the transition point? And Sri Aurobindo says the transition point is determined by your capacity to bear. Now when I'm sick, I'm in high fever, my body is weak, fragile, I've not eaten enough, I'm hypersensitive, the slightest touch produces for me too much. Why are you speaking so loudly? I can't stand it. My nerves are unable to contain. And when my nerves come back into strength, and perhaps in an exaggerated poise of energy, dominating, I am speaking loudly, not realizing that I might be hurting somebody else. And they can shout all they want, I can dominate and push back even more. What is the change? Is your capacity to bear. So Sri Aurobindo explains, in any life form or life experience, when there is a contact of any kind, as long as the contact is something which is within its capacity to assimilate and make use of, it experiences it as pleasurable. When the contact comes and it has no use for it, it can assimilate, it need not, it cannot, it doesn't matter, it's no use, then it is neutral. So the air is on my skin, I don't feel it. Neutral contact. The air blows when my skin is perspiring, I feel cool, it feels pleasant because I'm healthy. But when I'm in fever, the same air blowing, I feel a chill, I'm shivering. Because it's now harming my life, I'm unable to contain, it is overwhelming and harming me. It is destroying my ability to be in balance. So you notice, you have a working of life force, a point of contact from the universe. If it can absorb to grow, It's pleasurable. If it has no value, it is neutral. If the contact is disbalancing me and harms me, then it is painful. If you look at the nature of the experience, it is exactly the same thing. All that's changed is your consciousness's ability to contain or make use of it. Or the way your consciousness uses it, if you now look at it in absolute terms. When your consciousness takes the contact to grow, it is pleasurable. When it receives the contact to not grow or lose, it is painful. That's all. Positive direction or negative direction in the electricity of the contact. That's all there is to it. But if you look at it from an even more objective position, when this thing cannot contain the contact, well, it pretty much deserves to break down, to be replaced by what the contact is now forming around it. Something new. So in my body, when the contact is too harsh, the cells which are weak are being broken down, and the very contact entering creates now a new repair process, triggers off a new process of cell repair to replace what was already weak and fragile. Nothing wrong. It's just the way nature flows. Energy flows against energy, objects against objects, and something grows, something diminishes to be replaced by something else. Nothing is changing in the big picture. And so when you look at it from that poise of consciousness, nothing was ever lost. Nothing was ever built. It is just part of one continuum of change in the whole, remaining exactly what it was. And so from that poise, it seems as if equal to all events. I'm just showing you how there's a continuity in perspective. From being inside in the ego of this object, I am overwhelmed or I am nourished. You step out to something more impersonal, less egocentric, more inclusive. As this is being eaten by the other, that is growing. This bigger one, the plant is eating up the soil. The plant is being eaten by the goat. The goat is being eaten by some tiger. And I'm seeing the chain and I see nothing good or bad. It's just life force modifying itself through forms. And so there is an equal perspective. So from the poise of a consciousness which is one, which is equally in all things, there is no question of pain or pleasure. There is equality in the variation of experience. Whether more intense or less intense, I equally enjoy sensation and the play of the sensation. And at which point we will have to use a different word because it's neither pain nor pleasure, delight. Equally. In the soft caress and in the hard scratch. Delight. The glimpse of this you see in times when children are playing excitedly, they're playing football, they're running around, bumping into each other, all having great fun. They come back and now the energy diminishes. I'm feeling pain on my arm. Oh, I cut myself, it's bleeding. But I realize it now when my energy has dimmed enough that now the pain symptom emerges. But when my energy was high in the enthusiasm, that scratch was as pleasurable as a caress. To the divine consciousness which is in all things and embraces all things from within and from around, the bleeding is equally an experience of delight as the nourishing and the growth of everything. And so, but in the higher, it is an actively equal enjoyment of the divine delight. In what? What is the divine doing? Remember, we are looking at it from the perspective of the soul. What is the soul doing when nature is doing all this? Because increasingly as the soul ascends, it recognizes nature as expressing its own knowledge, its own control. Even eventually we will see its own power and energy. And so what is the soul doing? it choosing to be different things, different possibilities, like a creator, like a dreamer, like a script writer or a director of a play, it chooses, and nature is performing and unfolding. So what does nature experience? Manifesting itself. I wish to experience this, I wish to become this, and the moment I begin to experience the wish and the joy of it, nature begins to perform and unfold it. And the relationship increasingly now becomes, whatever I dream of, she is manifesting. Whatever I imagine now becomes true in the play of nature. And what's the joy then? Self-manifestation. So he says, in the higher, it is an actively equal enjoyment of the divine delight in self-manifestation. And now the relationship of the soul with nature has already shifted. Nature now is fulfilling all that the soul dreams itself or sees itself to be. Where earlier at the beginning, the soul felt itself constricted, bound by nature, which was trying to impose itself and its habits on the soul. And now it's the reverse, the joy of self-creation, self-manifestation. Now we will see, as I said earlier, this can be experienced on all levels. Even in our limited capacity that we have in life, every time our greatest joy in life is when we manifest some possibilities within us. The joy of creating something, the joy of expressing yourself. Now it's not always seen as works of art or works of music, which you are obviously manifesting from your own experience or state of consciousness. It's happening all the time. When the person is arranging a space to make it comfortable. You come into a new house, maybe there are things around, you say, I don't like this color, we'll change this color, we'll put a little paint here, we'll cut a little window there, we'll hang a picture here. What are you doing? You are shaping your circumstances to manifest you, your consciousness, your state of being, until it matches. When it matches, you say, now it is my space, my home, isn't it? Everything you do in life is ultimately an effort to manifest yourself. You're walking on the road, somebody falls and hurts himself. What do? You say, oh, poor fellow, and you walk on. Or you say, oh, can I help you? What's the difference between the two? The only difference is their state of consciousness and their relationship with themselves. In one, the person is naturally, temperamentally empathic, you will say, and so immediately the effort goes to help. In the other person, the person is temperamentally more observant and detached, disinterested in relationships, and says, oh, the fellow is not seriously hurt, it's okay, I can go on, poor fellow. The state of consciousness determines the spontaneous response in your nature, isn't it? If you think about it deeply enough, you come to a profound conclusion. All that you do, all that happens around you, whether you do it consciously or not, is a representation of who you are. If you become yourself truly, your circumstances automatically will become a reflection and expression of what you are. So be truly, and the becoming will take place. You will do it, but you won't think, do I do or not do? You flow, depending on what you are within. Your nature flows. Okay? So it's a profound insight. The problem is, am I myself truly? Not really. Right now I'm a bit confused in what I am in my awareness. And so there are kind of layers blocking who you are. Who you are truly is the soul, the divine presence, which is all good, which is all truth, sacred, beautiful. And if there were not intervening layers which distort, this is what would spontaneously express in life. But now what happens is there are layers, and the layers distort it. Because I am all good, and all beautiful. When in my circumstances there is ugliness or perversion, the layer, rather than expressing the all good to change the perversion by this power of the all good, it feels itself helpless, it feels itself trapped, and it tries to push back in anger, in upset, in agitation, because it is all good. It cannot stand ugliness or distortion, but reacts because there's a layer, not allowing the pure flow out. So when you, so to say, unveil the layers which distort and let what you are reveal itself, nature flows perfectly aligned to manifest effortlessly. You don't seem to be doing anything. Your nature is doing it, it's happening. You are knower, lord and enjoyer of nature. Now at this point he's brought us to this position. There is no loss of freedom, because you are never engaged and bound in the movement. You are simply consciously choosing being. There is no loss of freedom, no descent into an ignorant attachment. The man free in his soul is aware. Now remember what was driving nature? Is aware that the divine is the lord of the action of nature, that Maya is his knowledge, will, determining and effecting all, that force is the will side of this double divine power, in which knowledge is also present and effectual. He is aware of himself also, even individually, as a center of the divine existence, a portion of the Lord, the Gita expresses it, controlling so far the action of nature which he views, upholds, sanctions, enjoys, knows, and by the determinative power of knowledge, controls. Now, to the extent that you are in this space, which is in your space of control and view and control, you are representing the divine or a portion of the divine in this space. Otherwise, the divine is all that is doing, is the only one that's doing everything through nature. But here, where I am a portion of the divine in this space, the divine works through me in this limited activity. But in this, all these 6 layers, 6 relationships are present. So again, this is a long sentence with many implications. The most important outcome of this is you remain free. I'll give an analogy here again to highlight the difference. Let's say the soul now is seated in the chariot, which is the body, which has horses tied to it, our life energies or senses. And then there is the charioteer, the intellect, some part of the mind, which is guiding. And you're the tourist. What does a tourist do? You say, take me to the most interesting places. Now, I don't know what they are. That fellow knows, the horses know, the chariot has its own limitations. It cannot go into marshy space, it can only go where land is stable. And nature does its thing. But I set my relationship by saying, I want to experience the most interesting places, and all the machinery follows. As we go along, you know what? I don't like being inside dense forest. It scares me. Can you take me into open spaces? I don't know where the open space is. I don't know how to get there. They know, they do it. I'm just enjoying. But from this poise, I have never engaged myself in a way that I'm bound. What would it be to be bound? When I, sitting at the back, now get into what we call backseat driving. Turn left, turn right, slow down a little bit, go faster. Hey horse, you're not in sync with the other one. We should gallop together. And I put my hands into their legs and make them gallop. And now I am nature. I'm a creature of nature. Do I really have freedom? I'm bound in the very processes and tendencies of the horse. I'm lost. But here in this poise, I'm simply enjoying, and the whole journey shapes itself, and I wander and enjoy. As an analogy, it helps to recognize the difference. So now observe our own normal state. We are largely a product of nature. In the very moment when we think that we are thinking, there is a large part of nature still involved. I am thinking not so clear today. What will people say? I have to perform well. This is a demanding thing. People are going to judge me from what I say or do now. And this is still part of nature. Even the part which temporarily detaches itself to improve is still valuing itself in terms of nature values. What will people say? I will lose my credibility. I will not be liked by my friends. And when you first step back sufficiently, you begin to question those values. Am I here to live by other people's standards? What is my standard? What do I really want? And that introspection begins the first step of drawing out the deeper values of the true soul. But otherwise, while we experience ourselves, oh, I can control my thought, I can control my behavior, it's still a part of nature itself developing a kind of a partial self-control to improve herself. In a way, you are reflecting the freedom of the soul in a narrow part of your consciousness. But you do not have the true freedom until you are able to stand back completely from it all. So the first step of the journey is this poise of witness, to be completed as thoroughly as possible, from where then the process of self-mastery can begin. So you will recall the earlier portion where Sri Aurobindo again draws from the Bhagavad Gita. Increasingly as you become Swarat, free and a self-ruler over the kingdom of its own life and being, he can also exercise and increase control of the environment and the world to become Samrat, emperor of the world. But it starts with a center, and from where the whole relationship begins to grow. But what makes for this change of expansion of the relationship with larger nature? And that's the next sentence, all of which we will explore next time. He says, and when he universalizes himself, so far it was I, the individual, as a portion of the divine. When he universalizes himself, his knowledge reflects only the divine knowledge. When I was individual, it was the divine knowledge working, the divine will working, as the Maya force or action in nature. As the universalization takes place, my knowledge joins with that knowledge which was guiding nature. And his will effectuates only the divine will, which was so far guiding nature. So what happens? Your knowledge and your will joining with that larger movement, naturally the scope of the impact is also now greater. He enjoys only the divine delight and not an ignorant personal satisfaction. While earlier there was this partial delight of my personal satisfaction, it grows now into that which is part of the cosmic delight. Thus the Purusha preserves its freedom in its possession. At that point you are possessing literally the world in the scope of the enjoyment, and yet free. Renunciation of limited personality even in its representative enjoyment and delight of cosmic being. So you have abandoned the narrow limited individuality, you are enjoying this larger cosmic enjoyment, but also representing it in the limited being, which you are not bound to, but which is the focus of a certain part of the enjoyment. And delight of cosmic being in the whole. It has taken up fully in the higher poise the true relation of the soul and nature. And at this point that journey is complete. So these last two sentences, which are quite intricate and complex, we will explore in detail next Friday. where he looks at what was that aspect or power of God working in the nature, and how that works, and what is the relationship of the soul with that, and the universalization in which the individual soul joins with and is a part of the cosmic being while still maintaining the poise of individuality for the purpose of the play. Yes. Yes, the term used is Virat, large or vast, infinite in scope. So we pause here. And you see how Sri Aurobindo brings us to a deeper unity of these two. And then the next paragraph he will show how these two are aspects of the Satchidananda, and therefore it is always the same oneness of Satchidananda that takes this double poise and for the purpose of the play appears to be this irreconcilable opposite position of soul and nature, but secretly behind it is always the same one, Satchidananda, experiencing the delight of this particular aspect of the play. You can take up any comments or questions, or simply meditate on the theme. It's a beautiful vision.
Adjusting them to, I'm getting any negative feedback, so I'm adjusting my view on things. But then to use emotions or devotion almost feels like cheating or wanting to avoid what is really there. I don't know anymore than how to bring that part of the yoga back into the other.
I didn't get what is it about emotions? To change them?
Another part or another aspect of the yoga would be to use my emotions into devotion and to make the contact. But when I'm into these electric sensations and the small adjustment of emotion seems completely cheating.
Okay.
Can you say something about it, how it can come back in? Or
Okay, so if I understood, is what you're saying is in the sensations it's okay to play with that, but in the emotions it's not?
No. I mean, if I'm just into these electric sensations and dissecting the negative ones that might still occur and seeing what's my wrong attitude in that circumstance.
Yes.
If I would then use devotion or like my emotion to call the mother or something, it feels almost like cheating.
Why?
Because it feels like I'm instead of making really the adjustment, I'm just making a big jump.
But when you ask for you invoke a higher consciousness, that's your way of adjusting to it, isn't it?
There's a much smaller way where the adjustment is just seeing the fault in it and making the adjustment.
So there is a smaller adjustment you can make practically, that you find the situation uncomfortable and you adjust yourself to adapt to it. But sometimes you may experience a pressure which is too great that you're unable to adjust to because your capacity is limited. And at that point you call a higher intervention which has a greater capacity that fills you and assists in the adjustment. And that's legitimate equally. If the
remember and offer and come back. I mean, because many adjustments can be made during the day without remembering, offering.
The adjustment you can make purely from a rational effort to adapt to life and to use your circumstances for your benefit. But the whole thing could also be taken up into the process of a conscious growth of evolution. That's when the connection to a higher consciousness would become relevant. The difference is this: in one case a person is trying to improve himself but for a very limited purpose. In the second case, the person is trying to grow in consciousness but with a much larger objective, of which this is a small part. So self-development is not necessarily spiritual evolution. where the goal is much larger in the spiritual evolution. Self-development can have a very limited goal. I want to become more effective as a thief. I want to become more skillful in manipulating people to get what I want out of them. And so you develop your capacity and skill. And the goal is primarily egocentric and a short-term benefit. In the other case, which is the direction of yoga, I want to grow in my consciousness, to grow out of my limitations and even the ego sense into a divine awakening. And so there you make the contact consciously with the divine presence, asking its intervention or making the connection to change and transform your consciousness. So the scope of the goal is very different. And just that, the fact that you seek to exceed your own limitations, even in your limitation of the purpose that you start with, is what makes it the spiritual life.
I would just like to reflect and ask a question on the example you gave on the choice, conscious choice to be happy. And related to now big phenomenon around the world of positive psychology, that there is a lot of movement going, you can heal yourself by thinking positively, I'm happy, and then there's a lot of
Right.
scandal going around, and some leaders of this movement died of cancer and all that. So just
Okay. So recognizing the principle itself, that by changing the attitude of your consciousness, the whole movement of nature changes. The principle being valid, one can also recognize that the nature you're trying to change is part of a larger universal nature. And when you make a shift in your consciousness, the ripple effect may only go so far. There is also pushback from the larger nature, which needs a deeper, wider poise of consciousness to really change. And so many people who have attempted to change their illness, to heal themselves from a change of attitude or consciousness, have not recognized that the change of attitude was in a very superficial part of their nature, not from a more profound influence which had the power to change fully their nature or the influence of external nature. Now, just to take an example, somebody has an illness, you could trace it back, even if it's a cancer or some other form, you could trace it back to certain poisons which are in the food or in the water supply, which eventually get into the body and cause this imbalance. By change of your consciousness, yes, there'll be a huge change in your psychological layers, because those are the most plastic and responsive to your consciousness state. But as it ripples into the gross physical body, where there is a resistance and a dullness, the impact of the change is that much less. And the greater impact is of the poison that still continues to come into your food, which you never stopped. But if at that point you had access to a deeper or a higher spiritual consciousness, let's say the influence of the self kicks in and takes over the physical substance, it can drive out and modify even that nature. To a degree that in the body, such a person in the physical consciousness being established in the influence of the divine consciousness of the self, such a person could take in poison and either the body would utilize it, digest it, or expel it without utilization, but not fall sick. But that means you have already brought into effect a much greater power that this physical body is able to respond to more directly. So, do we take into account the balance of your current consciousness and the nature you have, and how far you are able to influence? There is a further problem that the consciousness you are exercising is only the mind or the mental will. Are you even conscious of tendencies in your emotions or instinctive likes and dislikes or fears in your life energies? And you didn't change those. So the fear tendency in me which provoked that particular illness was never corrected. All I did was brought positive thought. And so my positive thought is now struggling against my negative emotion, and which will win? Well, whichever is more powerful, whichever can last longer. But the effect again is to that extent less. If you could become fully conscious and correct from inside out with the full support of the self, that is a fully revealed consciousness, yes, potentially everything can be done. But in the absence of that, you have to take a practical position to recognize what is operating where and use that. So let me give an example here. In your mind, you took a positive attitude. In the emotions, you recognize that there are knots which you are unable to modify or you're not conscious of. But in your emotional life, energy, nature, it is responsive to a particular kind of external treatment. So yes, you tap into that. My emotions are still too negative or dark, I'm unable to change. But somebody else comes, let's say as an energy healer, who brings positive energy to infuse into your body, which momentarily changes that balance, and I get helped. Recognizing that I couldn't do it on my own, and so I use that external support. And then I hit the physical consciousness, and I realize in my body, the body has a conviction that this is the illness that it is dependent on, or it has the habit of responding to that poison by this reaction. And the body has a conviction that that counter to the poison will heal it. You call that medicine. So I give it the medicine because it is the body's faith. So, or habit of relationship. We call it faith again. So you have to recognize at each level, you have to address the imbalance or illness by the thing appropriate to that level. So in this case, my conscious mind as the choice maker, the sanctioner, says, fine, I can only influence so far the body, and it gives sanction to other means of allopathy or homeopathy or energy healing or whatever it is that it recognizes helpful. To say that I will only take this help but not that is to choose to refuse what could have helped on those levels. You see? So much of the confusion comes because people take a narrow view and block out the larger picture, which could otherwise have been, which should be otherwise multifaceted approach, taking into account the actual reality of your relationship with your nature. To remain in a higher consciousness in permanence would require you to ensure that every part of you is aligned to that consciousness. As long as there are parts within you which are not aligned to that higher consciousness, they either feel overwhelmed by the higher, or they feel themselves opposed to the higher, or they feel themselves neutral. In any case, since they cannot relate to the higher, they are the part of you that is not participating in the higher, and eventually when they are active, they will pull you into their state of consciousness. So as an example, most of the time this is the problem we have. In deep meditation, what do? You put your body into stillness. Make it quiet. You put your emotions into calm, make it quiet. Maybe a part of your mind also becomes quiet. And you go into some exalted state. And it is wonderful. The moment you come out and the activity of mind starts, which did not enter the exalted state, what does it do? It pulls you into its tendency. Then when the activity of emotions start, which never shared that state, they pull you into their tendency. And when the body becomes active, it pulls you into its dullness. And you have lost that state. Or rather, that state remains somewhere hidden inside, behind all these layers of activity. So the secret to maintaining that state of consciousness is to integrate it into these parts which are otherwise kept quiet. And when the mind now begins to feel and open to that higher light, when the life energy within you now begins to feel that higher quality of the energy and it fills it, and when the body itself now begins to become more conscious and aspiring for that, at that point you'll find you come out of the meditation and you're able to hold that state and be in activity. But still there may be a situation which provokes you strongly and you lose your temper, you get angry, because it means there are parts in your emotional nature which have not yet been infused with this consciousness. We have not yet been changed by it. And so that will be an occasion to remind you, this is a corner which is still impure, I need to bring this higher influence here. But the practical result is, as increasingly you bring the higher consciousness into all these parts, they begin to function differently by those higher values and by that higher consciousness. Your mind starts working differently. Your life energies are now filled with a higher inspiration rather than mechanical reaction. Even your body begins to feel the presence of the divine. And this process in which your nature is being changed or even transmuted or awakened to its own divinity is what Sri Aurobindo calls transformation. So your consciousness enters a high state, but your nature is left abandoned, it will pull you into it. But when your consciousness brings that high state into nature and reshapes nature in those terms, nature also rises to the same state as your consciousness. At that point, you live from a higher consciousness which is never lost, because everything in you is working from it. And this process of soul rising in consciousness, taking with it nature also rising in consciousness, merges eventually in the highest state when the soul and nature become one consciousness and power of consciousness. And this is the supramental transformation that Sri Aurobindo envisages, where even the physical body, although having character and density of physicality, can be a conscious instrument directly expressing the soul without any distortion, without any dulling, without any loss of inertia. And such a body can then inhabit the highest divine consciousness in the world, in the body, and make possible a divine life on earth. So we have to grow in this direction. In the integral yoga, every step of growth in consciousness must be followed by a stabilizing of that consciousness into all the parts of our nature and a change of our nature into that higher state. And so the both growing will give you that possibility to live from a divine consciousness in life. We can close with this. And continue next Friday.